Survival horror may have been a marketing term coined by Shinji Mikami and Capcom, but it could have just as easily described Capcom's dangerous financial state before Resident Evil. The cost of making games had risen considerably, recent releases hadn't performed very well, and the company had spent a small fortune on the Street Fighter movie in 1994.
You have to do better than that, okay?
Bankruptcy was on the horizon. Almost no one, not even the developers or the top brass at Capcom, or even an American consulting firm that advised Capcom to cancel Biohazard, expected this weird little project was going to make any money. But somehow, producer Tokuro Fujiwara used his S-tier persuasive skills and saved the project from cancellation. But the story of how the game somehow got made isn't just a story of perseverance. It's one of betrayal and stolen valor. But it's not all bad, because there's a silver lining of a redemption story. See, Shinji Mikami wasn't always the easiest guy to work for. This was his first job as a director, and he seems to have taken more credit for the game's quality than is likely owed him. As it turns out, the lion's share of the game's scenario, world building, and balancing actually came from scenario writer Kenichi Iwao, a man whose contributions have essentially been scrubbed from Resident Evil's history, save for a few select internet tomes. So what follows will be a cloaked review of both the first game and the remake, but framed with the story of Shinji Mikami, Capcom, and its unsung hero Kenichi Iwao. We'll look at the tumultuous development of one of gaming's most important franchises that almost didn't exist, how the revolutionary first entry would serve both as a lesson to Shinji Mikami and also provide a way for him to ultimately prove himself as a creative and as a good manager. So let's enter the world of survival horror. Let's uncover how Resident Evil and the Master remastered themselves and changed the future of Capcom and the industry forever. Though Shinji Mikami is often credited with inventing the now legendary term survival horror, 3D horror was the first term that Capcom used to describe Resident Evil internally. When Capcom had greenlit the game back in 1993, it was to be an SNES spiritual successor to Sweet Home, using its systems and atmosphere, and even a lot of its gameplay ideas like a party system with AI-controlled NPCs who could die permanently and whom you'd lose access to their abilities, and the game would thus get harder, just like Sweet Home. Tokuro Fujiwara had a feeling that horror was about to come into its own as a genre, and he and Capcom in general sought to employ the 3D graphical prowess of the new PlayStation console to make a uniquely affecting experience. For a year, the project toyed with an over-the-shoulder camera like RE4 would eventually have, before attempting to make RE a Doom-inspired first-person shooter. Before attempting to make RE a Doom-inspired first-person shooter, but that too proved technically impossible to make. Having an NPC controlled by an AI also proved too taxing, so that idea was scrapped, which is also probably why the STARS members hilariously keep splitting up in the final game.
Why on earth are you here?
It wasn't until the team took inspiration from Kenichi Iwao's favorite game Alone in the Dark that the project really started to take shape, adopting its fixed camera angles and static 2D backgrounds that freed up about 1100 pixels that could then be used on the up to 4 characters on screen at a time, a huge increase for the project. I guess you could say that Resident Evil went from being a Doom clone to a clone in the dark. A clone in the dark. Okay, I had to make that joke one last time because it's probably the last time I can get away with that one. So if you like that joke, there it is one more time for you. Capcom knew that the advent of the PS1 meant that gamers were looking for games with more complex storytelling techniques that could be supported by the new tech, so Resident Evil scenario took multiple diverse forms before finalization. One setup involved going up against a mad scientist, and you had to rescue other scientists in each level. Another let you play as one of 4 civilians who survived a plane crash in the forest, one of which was a cool-sounding psychic named Kenko, whose abilities reflected the more ghost-oriented supernatural story that Mikami had first toyed around with. In other builds, enemy types were ghouls, lumbering servants of some big bad somewhere, versus straight up generic zombies. In other builds, some characters were even going to be infected and get worse throughout the game. But Mikami's favorite story setup starred a special forces unit of Terminator-like cyborgs because he thought that, quote, strong and cool ones go over with a bang with players for main characters. But this is one of the last ideas that Mikami had come up with while working on the game almost entirely by himself for the first 6 months. But once Capcom got him some help in the form of scenario writer Kenichi Iwao, things started to change. Iwao immediately bounced off the cyborg idea because it wasn't conducive to a horror setting, and he set about changing the characters to humans right away. He started to design the game around evading enemies at any cost instead of killing them, or at least only being able to kill them, choosing and balancing the weapon types, magazine sizes, and even the item drops to reflect this ethos, which was inspired by Alone in the Dark, but also an obscure MSX game called Alcazar the Forgotten Fortress, which took place in dungeons that randomly generated limited supplies and enemy configurations that required strategy to herd them so you could get past them. Sound familiar? Apparently Nightshade on the NES was another inspiration, and scenes like Jill listening to Barry through the door came from fighting fantasy game books like House of Hell that were written by Ian Livingston and Steve Jackson of Munchkin fame. Iwao also created the Umbrella Corporation and Raccoon City. Initially, Umbrella had been conceived as a cult, but Iwao found the idea of a big pharma company being able to more easily influence world governments to be even more terrifying. Thus, the Umbrella logo became a duplicitous symbol of protecting the world from viruses when it was actually a shield to cover up what they were doing with viruses from the public. As for Raccoon City itself, the initial setting had been in the fictional town of Harnby, Arkansas, which is a bit ironic since Arkansas is extremely well known for cooking meth, and Umbrella really likes cooking up bioweapons. Fun fact, I one time got hired by a realtor to clean up the windows on a house she was trying to sell. It used to be a meth lab. It was black as soot all over the walls and the windows, and it took forever to clean up, and it was located just across the Memphis Bridge, and you guessed it, West Memphis, Arkansas. And a bit like Arkansas, which is ironically called the natural state for all of its attractions like hot springs, the final name of the game's setting in Raccoon City derived from the down-home, out-in-the-country feeling that Iwao noticed in North America, like how raccoons live in close proximity to humans, and this was reflected in Spencer Manson's closeness to the forest and nature, and how overrun it is with plants and animals. Now, ironically, as thoughtful and interesting as this world building was, Resident Evil still doesn't have a terribly good script, owed in some part to how much was cut.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
Mikami had always intended for Wesker, or Captain Hustler as he was known, to be a traitor, but he was supposed to have much more build-up as to his betrayal of the STARS team, and even some STARS members would become zombies or relay more information about this backstory themselves. Another cyborg-like character from an earlier build named Gelzer was supposed to be another traitor assisting Wesker. Tyrant was going to have far more abilities and even wings at one point, which makes the spine tingle thinking of that thing being even harder to kill. The T-Virus was initially intended to be a parasite like you might see an alien instead of a mere infection, something that RE4 Onward would really lean into. The heliport used to be its own level. There was even to be a graveyard, a swamp, and castle locations, and even claymore mines and passive defensive items that you could use against zombies, as well as the ability to barricade them out of rooms. Numerous other monsters, like this disgusting rat-snake amalgam and mayflies and other horrors, were eventually cut as they were part of the swamp levels. I mention all this because, as it turns out, many of Resident Evil's best ideas seem to have originated with Iwao, even if their actual delivery was a bit suspect. As evidenced by his extremely comprehensive interview with CrimsonHead.com, Iwao could rattle off even speculative parts of the fiction because he knew it backwards and forwards. Iwao was so on top of it that during development, the team started to come to him with their questions and input instead of Mikami, which really rubbed Mikami the wrong way. Eventually, Mikami had enough, even mocking Iwao by saying, "Look what a game he's made," before getting him fired and relocated to Breath of Fire 3's development. Iwao was subsequently scrubbed for the credits in various versions of the game. Mikami even later blamed him in the press for some of the game's problems, and he and Hideki Kamiya leaned into their own legend as the primary visionaries in the biographical comic The Men Who Made Biohazard, much to Iwao's chagrin. Somehow, all these years later, Iwao doesn't bear Mikami any ill will, because Mikami later approached Iwao and told him that he was the one who deserved to receive the Best Scenario Award that Resident Evil won. So that's a very John Romero, John Carmack reconciliation level moment, and it speaks to a big truth. This game was not just the product of one man's vision, but many gifted people who made sizable contributions, as this team had some of the industry's finest on board before they would eventually become those big names. As it turns out, as grueling as this project would be, Mikami would have to prove himself all over again once this was all over. Mikami was a first-time director, and it was showing. He had previously shown his insecurity in how he dealt with Iwao, but he also directed and cast the famously goofy FMV sequences himself. Looking back, the camp seems intentional, as zombie B-movies were the likely inspiration, but Mikami admits he was not satisfied with them because he cast off looks and not talent. Mikami was supposedly very unhappy with how they turned out. To make matters worse, the team also started bleeding personnel one by one due to the stress and pressure and general inexperience of many members, leading to a frustrating trial and error workflow, or lack of workflow. The remaining members had to start working double shifts to cover for the lack of personnel. For the final 6 months of work, the team essentially lived at the workplace, working until 3 a.m. most nights. The lack of manpower and necessary skills led to Capcom canceling the Saturn version of the game and a consulting firm even advising the top brass to, quote, discontinue Biohazard project. Still, despite all these problems and Mikami's own missteps, even Iwao was quick to give Mikami credit, saying that he proved his competence by keeping the ship afloat. Mikami himself recalls that the team kept a positive, playful attitude that saw the project through to completion. As the early morning hours would set in, team members would run wildly around the floors together or push each other in office chairs into the elevators and say sayonara to them as they went down to their desired floor. It seems that despite all the turmoils of development, the team had abided by the rule that Mikami had learned from his mentor, the game's producer, Fujiwara, who said, create freedom and side restriction. Funnily enough, as much as Mikami is praised for his work on Resident Evil, and as much as he says he loves horror movies like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, he really didn't want to make this game in the first place because he hated being scared. And yet this is exactly what Fujiwara wanted to hear. If he'd answered that he never got scared, I couldn't have trusted him with the project. People who aren't afraid of anything don't understand what's frightening. In my view, you can't make a horror game if you don't have any fear. Fujiwara said despite Alone in the Dark's important influence on Resident Evil, that it was too bright and not scary enough. Shots fired. Early scenes like the turnaround zombie set the tone, though. This game isn't zany or quirky, it's gory and schlocky and intense. And while the camera placement was key, for the player to actually feel scared, they had to feel it in the way the game played, how it disempowered them and still asked them to succeed in spite of it. Mikami told Games Radar that he wanted to control players' mental states. If the enemies were only scary because of the possibility of game over, it wouldn't be sufficient for me to reach my goal with Biohazard. There had to be more to it than that. Capcom repeated Sweet Home's classic door opening animations with a deliberately restrained black background and simple sound effect, which is the equivalent of getting the player to hold their breath as they anticipated what horrors might appear in the next room once it loaded. Camera angles intentionally granted to poor comprehension of the space, requiring you to venture further into the frame to change the camera and get a better view, which would in turn likely put you headfirst into the zombies that were just out of your vision that you could hear shuffling around and growling. But sensory tricks wouldn't carry the day either. The game has to feel in its rhythms like you're under duress. The translated game design document, that's not attributed to anybody in particular, but was probably very influenced by Iwao, laid out this strategy. 1. Because this game isn't a game where the player mows down enemies one after another, it simply will always be stronger than the party. 2. The goal is to survive and find the escape route while solving the mysteries hidden inside the mansion. 3. The two main characteristics for this game should be finding ways to A. solve puzzles and B. deal with enemies. Importantly, unlike a JRPG like Sweet Home, there was no dedicated combat mode. It was all real-time and meant to generate what the design doc called suspenseful and palpitating atmosphere to a heart-stopping degree, and as our secondary targets, an undulating sense of tension. While Alone in the Dark is the first game to use cinematic camera angles and tank controls to tax the player into a feeling of anxiety, that game was fairly accessible in that you had an unlimited inventory size, you could drop items anywhere at any time, and you could quick save at any time in one of 5 slots. Not only did Resident Evil limit the number of items that you save in the first place, but they also took up inventory space, and there was no way to drop items. While Resident Evil didn't actively encourage combat, it required it as a kind of key item in and of itself, knocking down a zombie with 3 shots to run past him, unlocking the way forward like you're some kind of
Master of unlocking.
Survival horror then isn't just merely the lack of ability to fight back, but how you fight back, what fighting back costs, and how it feels. The design doc confirms this. By giving combat a feeling of exhilaration, we would completely get detached from the point of this game. Combat as an action in this setting needs to only be an emergency measure in order to escape from truly unavoidable situations when the player is driven into them. 1. Generally, the enemies need to be stronger than the party. The default is to run away from enemies. 2. We won't construct absolute completion methods with defeating enemies. There exist different ways. 3. Realization and experience mean everything. It's the way of combat. Realization equals split-second judgment. In the game world, this translates to constantly wondering if you need to pick up that ammo or save room for any keys you need to access new parts of the manor soon. If you guessed wrong and were full up by the time you found a key item that you wanted to pick up, you'd have to backtrack all the way to one of the limited save rooms to clear out your inventory into the storage box and venture right back to that area, testing your memory of where that location was, and also avoiding or having to kill enemies that still exist in your path. And God help you if you have to use that crappy map that requires too many clicks to open. I'm not bitter. Now, of course, its cinematic acumen was unmatched by anything that had come before, and that fun and entertaining vibe would soar the series into massive popularity, but Resident Evil's most important precedents that it set are intentionally arbitrary resource limitations to invoke a feeling of constraint that you have to work against. And this in turn encourages backtracking that asks you whether you want to clear out hostiles for good, to make the way safe, or to keep trying your luck running past them, all the while giving you combat options to assist your way forward as chosen. Now, I appreciate the ideas here personally, and the commitment the team had to unflinchingly apply them to the player, but I will admit that I like them more theoretically than in practice. Even playing as Jill, who has 2 more inventory slots than Chris, there is still way too much need to backtrack simply because the game has so much to pick up and so little carrying space. Now some argue that's the point, like they did when I talked about the same thing with Signalis. But when there's no real interesting challenge and it's just a space issue, this mechanic feels like padding. What I mean is, say you cleared out all the hallways, or you're just really good at it. That's fine, but you're really just doing errands at this point to ferry stuff back and forth. Considering that many areas aren't that hard to clear out and enemies don't respawn, there's no real reason to enforce this system so hard since you're not really being asked to keep dodging the same foes or keep combat-centric items on hand at the expense of key items or whatever. Like, I understand what it's trying to encourage, but the lack of save rooms and numerous sections mean you're often having to do a huge amount of tasks before going back half the map to the one save room you can remember where it is. I just don't think the tedium is actually contributing to a sense of stress and tension other than, I hate this and I want it to end. The puzzles also feel a bit arbitrary, even for a video game, with an element of sliding bookcases and trapdoors and all that. That said, some puzzles really make you feel like a little smart boy, like when you have to make V-Jolt to weaken Plant 42.
I'm getting the water.
Actually, speaking of V-Jolt and Plant 42, let's talk about the residence area specifically real quickly. I find the mansion sections of RE1 to be the most laborious, the most arbitrary, and the most boring. But the constant looping around back and forth across 4 sections of 2 floors, clicking on doors to hope the key you found applies to them, is not particularly stimulating. But the residence, despite not really coming up in the average discourse very often, at least as far as I can tell, is both thematically and ludically the most tight and the most rewarding to me. The residence also most closely embodies the spirit of Raccoon City as Iwao imagined it, nature encroaching upon civilization. Vines and spiderwebs coat the walls, and a vine whips up through the floor to grab you. Plant 42 is the obvious crescendo here, but we also have a foretelling of how things have been infecting even the natural world in the Cerberus dogs and Yawn the giant snake back in the manor. Here, we have snakes that drop down on you as you run through the courtyard. Then in the residence itself, we have killer beehives.
No, not the bees! Not the bees!
Enormous, horrible spiders who spit acid at us, and even a boss that breaks apart into a million little spiders when it dies. There's also the shark-infested waters down here where Plant 42's vulnerable root system lies. It's just so chock full of enemies and world building. The tunnels, the less said about them the better, as they have one whole save room, and a ton of hunters, which are my least favorite enemies. I will say though, the inclusion of this rolling boulder trap made me smile because of the great boulder punch of 2008 in RE5, but also because of how prevalent this Indiana Jones gag was in proto-survival horror games like Dr. Hauser in 1994 and D the Game in 1995. The middle manor portion is basically even less enjoyable because we're back to wall humping with keys to see what opens. Then we have to dodge these hunters that can leap across the room and chop us in half, and they're really easy to miss because they tend to react to you sighting in on them. If you don't fire fast enough, they just jump across and hit you, and they can keep doing that.
Are you okay, Barry? Maybe you're getting tired.
No, I'm all right. Don't worry.
But at least the labs are returned to form as they feel like they matter the most, being the source of the evil, and it's also one of the most intuitive areas to figure out. The introduction of Ada Wong here in the notes is just Ada, as part of a computer password. It is awesome to see as someone who knows her well from later entries. Seeing the hilarious revelation that Wesker is actually one of Umbrella's scientists, and he's still wearing his huge out-of-place sunglasses in an underground bunker is just life-giving. Also interesting to see how many Bible verses were incorporated into Umbrella's kind of self-righteous cult speak. They think they're going further multiplying like the stars of the sky in Genesis 22:17, but they're actually bringing about something akin to the fall of man in the Garden of Eden, as this Adam and Eve painting suggests. Very cool stuff. The lab sings to me because it's a tight, smartly designed area that's easy to map out mentally, and the enemies are horrifying and tough to beat, like the new naked zombies and the chimeras, which are these horrible bugmen that will keep you up at night and not in a fun way. I do have to lament how awful the Tyrant is as a bad guy, at least in terms of gameplay. His first form is fine and feels appropriately tough and scary, but man, once you get to that final boss fight, he can dash and swipe in a very hard to dodge way that clears you out in a couple hits, and that stun lock is just something else, meaning you can get hit once and have to restart back at the item box. Full disclosure, if I didn't have the quick save feature to scum my way through this fight on an emulator, I never would have gotten past this, nor would I have wanted to. Just atrocious balancing, and one which interestingly got rebalanced crazy hard in the 2002 remake.
You guys are idiots. No one understands its real value.
All told, I can see why Resident Evil 1 is revered as a game changer, but rarely talked about as one of people's favorite games in the series. It's not because it's boring per se, but because it's kind of tedious in how much it wants you to just ferry crap back and forth endlessly and surprise you with the need for a key you put down all the way back across the mansion in your storage box because you hadn't used it for a long time and wanted it to stop clogging up your inventory. Time for another errand. Now the mansion is a pretty enough place, but it is kind of boring. There's not much internal logic to it. There's not very much good loot. There are a lot of rooms that just don't really have anything in them, and so it makes exploration rather unsatisfying. The residents in the labs, though, carried the experience for me and really made me appreciate this playthrough as a player and not just as a museum goer who wants to know where the genre got its best ideas from.
Just as I thought.
Now, as unimpressed as my personal tastes were with this game, as I don't find it particularly scary and I find it quite tedious, it's obvious why it caught on, especially coming from somebody who has played the Alone in the Dark series prior to this. It's got all the action movie charm of stupid one-liners, corny zoom-ins and overacted screams, macho smoking, Chris is built like a fridge, you get grenade launchers and flamethrowers to fight giant snakes and lizards and spiders and plants. Like it's full-on nuts. Resident Evil is really barely a zombie game, either in the enemy concentration, but also in the lore, which is more interested in perverting existing animal types and being more complicated than mere undead infections. That larger-than-life sci-fi feeling is here off the bat, and I think that's important. Mikami himself noted in the Evil Within press tour as well as an Archipel interview that he's always been about entertainment first and foremost, so whatever feels the most entertaining is what he's going to make. It's why he made RE4 so differently, because he and the team were pretty tired of making the same old fixed cam type of game, and thought leaning into the more action-oriented side of things would be more fun for everyone involved. Now sure, it took several games for Resident Evil to go full blockbuster, but the foundation was always there in the lore and the weapon loadouts. It's just a matter of emphasis. It's also why Alone in the Dark was quickly forgotten. Instead of leaning into the puzzle adventure side of things, Infogrames kept trying to adapt its clunky gameplay to compete with Doom and Wolfenstein. But Capcom deftly maneuvered between action movie tropes and a real feeling of restriction and danger at every step. The game eventually sold twice as much as Capcom anticipated, which Mikami admits was very lucky considering that the PlayStation's popularity picked up right at the same time. And as they say, a high tide rises all ships. But despite this success, Capcom apparently lacked some kind of confidence in Mikami's directing style, immediately telling him to get to work on a sequel, but as its producer, giving Hideki Kamiya the reins of directing. Now, part of me wonders if Mikami might actually be better at this role as a producer in some ways, like he was in Evil Within 2, though he notoriously gets a bit antsy if he's not hands-on for very long. But even when he is, RE4 and Evil Within's very messy dev cycles prove that he can take a while to arrive on an idea that he likes. In the first Resident Evil's case, his formative Terminator Special Forces idea likely wouldn't have worked nearly as well as the situation and characters that Kenichi Iwao came up with, and supplemented with smart ideas about resource restrictions and combat being a necessary but not scripted option for the player. Still, it's to Mikami's credit that the thing got to the finish line, and he clearly exhibited a competency with the good ideas of his team. Capcom relieving him of his director's duties right away, despite his huge success, actually got him down for a while, as you can imagine. But when the opportunity came knocking not 5 years later to remake his directorial debut for the Nintendo GameCube, he leapt at the chance. From my perspective, knowing what I know now about how much credit he and the others took for Iwao's ideas, I now see the 2002 remake as the true test of whether Mikami could prove himself. So let's see how that went.
Resident Evil, more terrifying than ever, comes to Nintendo GameCube.
So the 2002 remake of Resident Evil was devised for several reasons. For one, Capcom had a contract with Nintendo that required them to release new and old Resident Evils for the GameCube, and the original game's poor localization and widely lampooned acting was another reason to tune it up. The GameCube's power was, much like the PlayStation in the original pitch, the perfect way to realize this game's vision, only now with the power of hindsight and many victories already won in terms of the base mechanics. Interestingly, history would repeat itself yet again. Despite wanting to make the background CG, technical problems meant that the team, called by the less than sexy moniker Capcom Production Studio 4, used pre-rendered backgrounds yet again. But to the game's credit, the voice acting and the animations and cutscene direction, while still not top tier, are much better than before. Although I was kinda sad that they removed a lot of the stupid dialogue like Master of Unlocking and Jill's Sandwich.
A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
But there is at least a worthwhile trade-off in the somber, serious atmosphere being maintained as a result. Now, I mentioned earlier that while general recollections of fans say that the original is scary and all that, I really didn't find it to be so. It could be, but it was primarily a kind of pulp sci-fi game with some scares in it here and there. I cannot make the same claim about the remake though. Capcom from the outset wanted to make this game scarier by far. In developer interviews, the word that kept coming up was real. They wanted this to feel real and really scary in a way that no other Resident Evil had felt before. Instead of the bright lights and the high contrast colors of the initial Spencer mansion, especially its main hall, almost every room in the remake is some form of gray, brown, and white, often shrouded in shadow and only illuminated by scant candlelight or a lantern. Environmental artist Naoki Katakai would frequently spar with Mikami over making the environments look real but not scary, and arguments over lighting reoccurred all the way up to the end of development. Katakai noted that despite the fact that he and Mikami butted heads a lot and he was even called pig-headed and stubborn, Mikami still mostly let him work unhindered. It seems to me that Mikami had really settled in as a director, having since directed Dino Crisis in 1999, and seeming to be certainly opinionated but ultimately trusting of his artist at the end. I did find it exceedingly funny though that he and another artist, Kenichi Yoshimura, used to get into tiffs over Jill's bust size and how best to accentuate it. I guess you could say these guys really just cared about what was best for the project. What's unfortunate is that the realness of the world means that the lack of stylization or bright colors makes it mentally hard to picture where you've been or where you want to go or what function much of anything has, at least in the mansion. The map is far more helpful here, thankfully, noting which doors are locked or unlocked or have not been tried yet, and helpfully marking save rooms, but actually navigating the space has no real flow, even as someone who went straight from the original into the remake. The layouts changed just enough and added enough things that relying on your memory of the first game doesn't always work. Everything also just sort of feels like a dead end, and there's still not much logic to what goes on here. The new weather vane puzzle makes very little sense. Far too many puzzles have been remixed so that they require more pieces, many of which you find hours before you'll ever need them, so you'll have to have one of the patented errands all the way back to the last item box to retrieve a thingy to make the device or puzzle go brr, when there was no way of knowing that it was coming up. It's the same problem of tedious back and forth as before, but way worse now. Fortunately, at least the horror atmosphere is much stronger in many places and it makes these errands a little bit more interesting. Zombies are now much more detailed and hideous and loud. Their grunts much more guttural, and they're often placed in much harder to see areas where the player is often running into them full stop because the camera angle has obscured them. Sound balance was also a huge priority for the team as the soundtrack couldn't overpower the gameplay, as the player needed to be on edge trying to discern whether there was a zombie shuffling nearby or if that was just the sound of the moths hovering around the fluorescent bulb above you. The amount of scripted events where door handles rattle as you walk past, or how zombies will sometimes break through doors or jump out of corners, really makes this thing feel much more terrifying than the first game. That's also because, to add to the horror of survival, these zombies take way more damage than they used to before they die, they grab the player a lot more and do a lot more damage, and because they now can resurrect after some time into the terrifying Crimson Heads. These are much faster and much more damaging versions of the base zombies, and their growls will make you lose your bowels. Capcom's decision to finally use the defensive items idea that the original had proves to be a really smart one, and one that would inform later games in the series like RE2 Remake where knives could be used to automatically stave off zombie attacks. That said, I do wish it was optional when you wanted to use these defensive items, as it would be just another decision that the player could weigh, especially if their inventory was clogged up with healing items that they needed an excuse to expend, and they wanted to preserve their tasers and daggers for later. Their ability to resurrect also incentivizes you to take care of the burning bodies mechanic, which makes you have to carry around a lighter and a flask filled with fuel once you've found that, so you can burn the bodies so they don't resurrect as Crimson Heads. Trying to rush past them after they become Crimson Heads likely means you're toast, but you'll expend a decent amount of ammo re-killing them if you choose to engage. It's a thoroughly unnerving mechanic and adds a really cool layer to the game, even if it's a bit of a fake-off, as I found later on that just unloading your shotgun into them a couple times is usually enough to end their renewed menace. Still, it's a great new addition and proof that the team is operating at a high level. One of the best new inclusions is almost entirely original, but it's based off one of the early cutting room floor concepts from the original game. I'm talking the new trail through the forest to the cabin and the graveyard, a scrapped location from the first game that's revived here in almost identical form. The graveyard is mostly incidental on this pathway that you're running, although it does house the very powerful and very fun Magna weapons, so don't miss that if you can decipher the moon logic of what it requires to unlock. The real attraction here though is who lives here. I'm talking about the best part of Remake, Lisa Trevor. I love this chick. She is full on out to lunch. Whereas the first Resident Evil's horror references and art direction were rather tame and conservative, big spider, big snake, classic Romero zombie, etc., Lisa Trevor breaks the mold entirely and ushers in an aesthetic that Mikami would lean into with RE4 and then absolutely lose his mind with later on in The Evil Within. Lisa is the child of George Trevor, a character from the first game, who used her as a guinea pig for the T-virus, who becomes hideously mutated, and once her parents die, she starts to wear her mother's skin a bit like Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre does. She shows up out of nowhere at the end of a completely enemyless and super linear pathway, and she surprised the hell out of me except for the fact that the game shows its hand a little bit by giving me a suspicious angle of the door and telling me how good a look we can get at that door from here, like something's going to come through on our way back out of here. And lo, it do be like that this time. Lisa shows up looking like the casserole from the Black Mesa microwave after Gordon Freeman messed it up, and we run away without incident, scared out of our britches, but me thinking, well, that was a fun Easter egg. I didn't realize the broad was going to keep following me around, and I couldn't be happier that she did. She appears out of nowhere again down the tunnels and requires a timing-based puzzle to escape, all the while having to dodge her wild, wide swings before we can get away. Finally, she shows up again and starts mutating further into the type of tendril beast that the soon-to-be-released RE4 would lean into with the Ganados. In my Jill playthrough, it took Barry covering for me to give me time to push these weights off the narrow platform we were fighting on, so they can raise the lid off her mother's coffin and distract her with her mother's skull before she just jumps to her presumed death. Realizing that you don't actually need to fight her at all actually makes this encounter a bit too easy. But the first time I didn't realize quite what to do, so I played it like I needed to soften her up or make her charge me and knock off those weights herself, and this was such a rush, I can't even tell you. Lisa is a terrifying new addition, easily the best part of the game. This addition not only brings to life unfinished concepts in the first game, which is an exciting thing to have the opportunity to do, but she and her accompanying new sections wind up being the most horror movie adjacent fun in the whole game, and it's something I wish we got to see a little more of, that kind of classic horror movie stuff. Probably why I like Village so much more than the average person does, or why RE7 felt so good. Next up, the tunnels are mercifully less boring and mostly bereft of hunters, unlike the tunnels in the first game. The fact that they end with that Lisa chase solidifies them as being just better, period. But again, Residence's tight design and feeling of actually being themed around something is what makes it the best part of the game yet again. It's the least confusing and the most internally consistent. Holy hand grenades of Antioch are the spiders grosser than ever. Don't even get me started on the sharks. I was really glad I got eaten alive in the newly renovated shark room, as it was so terrifying I just had to slow clap. The sharks were honestly cupcakes in the original, but here they are diabolical, being much harder to shake and making you wade through walkways that they had complete access to swim across while you're stuck on the path hoping to avoid them. Neptune's now big as a house, and you have to do this weird pipe puzzle to drain the water before he gets you. And even then, the son of a gun still needs to be electrocuted to death to finally shuffle off this mortal coil. This section was a huge upgrade for me. Now the hunters are just as unfair and full of cheesy iframes as before, beheading me and ruining 15 to 20 minutes of progress so much that I had to avoid their little spawn in near the west stairwell save room that I really liked. Mercifully, there's a lot fewer of them in this version than there are in the original game. Black Tiger is still an absolute wimp, even more so than the original. Yon is also surprisingly much easier here, but he's also a lot more fun to fight. I'm a really big fan of his design here, as his boss fights in the original are just clunky. It's really easy to get stuck in the middle of him coiling up and just not be able to get out. But I'll tell you what made my last encounter with Jan so memorable was that I had actually run out of ink ribbons and had forgotten the medal in the book down at the bottom of the hole because I died from being beheaded by the hunters and forgot to go back down there. I also hadn't found the location of Jan's second boss fight at this point because the map didn't say there was a door at the end of the pathway on the map, so I didn't know I needed to return there with the helmet key. But once I got all that figured out and sorted with the help of a walkthrough, of course, which is kind of my constant companion here, I had to journey across the entire map with no ability to save and a dwindling supply of grenade launcher ammo to retrieve the red book medal, do the final Lisa Trevor boss, and then take on Jan in a second boss form and retrieve the medal from him to get into the lab, all without dying. I pulled it off, it took me like an hour, and I felt like I had just experienced peak survival horror. This was a really important adrenaline rush for me to have because I don't like that much about the remake, in all honesty. It's just way too confusing and samey looking, and the pacing just feels off to me. Combat can be pretty frustrating too, as everything's a bullet sponge, and if you can actually get it to die, it just ends up coming back. The save rooms are so few and far between in the most taxing combat areas, and yet they're far too plentiful in the easiest sections of the game. But this euphoric, tense gauntlet of no saves, meaning no mistakes or I'd lose an hour of progress, was so powerfully rewarding that once I pulled it off, I wouldn't trade it for all the frustration elsewhere in the game. The lab still flows very well as an area and even adds in a really cool wrinkle where you have to carry a very volatile and fragile fuel cell to repower a device, and you can't run, shoot, or get hit, or it'll explode, killing you instantly. What this actually means is that you really just have to kill every chimera in the area and then come back and just slowly walk through, as there's no way you don't get hit by them and die if you're just trying to walk past, but it's the thought that counts. The only part of the last section that I found strange is how the team made Tyrant so profoundly easy. There's a new gun in the mansion called the self-defense gun, which has one extremely high damaging shot in it, so I just kept it for this fight. But then Barry stepped in, kept Tyrant occupied, and I just unloaded on him with my Magnum as well before using the self-defense gun, so that Brad, the helicopter pilot, immediately dropped the rocket launcher, and then I immediately dropped the Tyrant with it. Unlike the original, which was an almost painfully unfair fight, this one was almost too easy, as you're really not required to dodge it at all. I had Barry's help to distract him, a cheaty face gun that almost acted like a second rocket launcher that knocked him into a state of defeat almost by itself. But hey, at least using a guy like a mofo helped me figure out how to actually rescue Chris after using the MO discs, instead of just unlocking the way to his cell and then forgetting about him and how to get him out again. Thanks, game. Seeing he and Barry and Jill running alongside each other warmed my heart and got my adrenaline pumping right before the last boss. And then we all get to fly away together. That's all! So, yeah, that's the remake. Like the original game, I don't find myself loving it either. The first game's to be commended though for establishing that combat and the inability to drop items and the need to preserve save items meant you were often backtracking to resupply or drop stuff off or just raw dogging new areas with nothing but the clothes on your back oftentimes. It's quite a rush, I suppose. That can also be quite a pain. It's not something that I particularly love. Either way, there's a clear progression from the original to the remake, and a wonderful appreciation shown to the original's unused ideas that make for a much more complete experience, like Lisa's new sections, the inclusion of the defensive items, the actual scary atmosphere this time around, and more. Now, Mikami is by no means solely to blame for this game's success either, but I feel more comfortable allowing him to take more of the credit than when he showed his ass a bit with Iwao. He seemed to need some time doing other things before returning to the director's chair in Dino Crisis, before really proving that he knew what Resident Evil was all about in 2002. Not many people get second chances of such a specific nature. The numerous developer interviews indicate that Mikami was still something of a hard-ass, bit of a perfectionist, but he wasn't above letting his guys work. He did need them to know where his preferences lie and why they were important. And like Iwao said, Mikami still showed us competence in making sure the first game was a smash hit. The remake, however, has essentially and perhaps unfortunately replaced the original in many fans' heart, being lauded as the best survival horror game ever made.
That's Umbrella's intention.
That might even be more impressive, that you somehow managed to displace the fundamental game. Can you imagine the id Software guys coming back and remaking Doom and that ever being more popular than the original game? Kinda hard to imagine, right? But interestingly, despite the remake often being regarded as the ultimate Resident Evil experience and being the 9th best-selling game in the series, it had only sold 1.35 million copies as of May 2008, 6 years after its release. Its sales started strong but fell off pretty fast, and it's why the soon-to-be-released Resident Evil 4 in 2005 took such an action approach, as they anticipated that players were becoming either fatigued or disinterested in the measured pace of tank controls and the like. It wasn't until the HD remaster some years later that came to consoles that the game's sales really took off, but by then it was a bit late in terms of giving Capcom the necessary messaging to stay the course. RE4 would start a trend that the series is very rarely diverted from, at least until RE7. But regardless of the outcome, the remake should be lauded for the confidence and comprehensive vision that reflects Mikami's maturity and focus since the original in 1996. I think he grew up quite a bit after a rather petty disenfranchising of the heart and soul of Resident Evil in Kenichi Iwao, and a somewhat tenuous relationship with people like Kamiya, and the eventual timeout of being relieved of directorial duties for several years by Capcom before getting back into the fray. And that's Resident Evil in general for you, from 1996 to 2002. A history of survival, of coming into its own and refining even genre-defining ideas into something even better than before. Now, I can't say personally that I enjoyed it, nearly as much as anybody else seems to, but I can respect the hell out of it. And its longtime visionary Shinji Mikami, a guy I already quite admired for Resident Evil 4's excellence, and for one of my favorite games in The Evil Within, which used a lot of the same style and horror movie goodness that Mikami was leaning into in the remake, especially the traps idea that he finally got to use, and other things like that pulpy horror that Lisa Trevor exemplifies. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, but I'd say remastering a masterpiece worked out just fine for this master of the craft. Thanks for watching. And now, before I go, I need to shout out my patrons. Mark Neubauer, Deadforge, A. Blondie, Bibby F. in Bloxburg, Melancholy Geek, Luke Dudney, and, brand new this month, survivalhorrors.com. Now, as you know me, I'm a pretty big fan of survival horror in general, and if you are, you should definitely go check out this website. It's actually quite well put together. There's a lot of buzz. You can even go into the Discord held by the site creator JMM Reviews. Very active. They're all fanatics, deeply invested in the genre, and you'll get a lot of fun conversations out there too. But yeah, go ahead and check out that website. It's an enthusiast paradise. And a great big thank you for joining on this month. I really appreciate it. And last but not least, a very special shout out to, of course, James Wyatt and the Interview for being so great as to subscribe to my Patreon's highest tier. Now, if you want to join these guys in supporting me, now is actually the best time. In addition to getting shouted out at the end of videos like this and getting early access to whatever's coming out next, I'm dropping additional written reviews on Patreon of games, movies, and TV shows. And we have just started doing a monthly Q&A where you can ask me anything you want, and I'll answer. God bless you, everyone, and I'll see you next time.